on the topic of consistency and kind of the different elements that go into running a really well-established kind of end-to-end grant program. So when I say end-to-end, I really mean everything from like the launch of the website and like marketing and data collection side of things, unless of course it's a private back-end invite-only grant, all the way to the fund disbursement, kind of grant reporting, impact reporting, and things like that. And we kind of play this little game and model out like what are all the elements that go into a successful grant. And I think what typically ends up happening is we say, okay, well, we have to collect applications. Once these applications or these grant submissions come in, we have to be able to do something with them, right? Generally speaking. And then ideally, where there's a compliance process where you take those grant applications, you share them with the team, and there's some type of selection, and then you award funding. And that's at its core, like the three main pillars to a grant. The challenge that I think a lot of us, when we go to implement these programs and as we get started, we fail to kind of think through like what are all the moving pieces and elements that make up those three pillars. I'm talking about like as granular as as the applications come in, how are we going to send reminder messages? Do we want to track people who are in progress? We can send updates as we go. How are we going to go ahead and generate reports? How are we going to go ahead and do the review and selection process? What happens if you've got a review committee where some people are just a bit more strict than others as they do their judging? How do you start to normalize the results to ensure that the most qualified candidates are the ones that get selected? I mean, that list goes on and on and on. And so as we kind of start to role play and play this game, as organization, the person actually had like a little sketchbook and they're writing out like literally all the elements. And they came up with like 50 to 60 tasks or checklist items that they wanted to make sure that they were addressing to run their grant. And it just kind of brought up like the topic of systematizing your grant management process. And we talked a little bit about how like what is the idea behind a system. And so if you say, okay, well, you have to get from point A, which is the launch of your program, and point Z, which really for you might be like measuring impact, although you could argue it's the distribution of funds, like what happens between points B and Y, right? All those things that happen in the middle. And if any of those elements or the chain or the system breaks, how it impacts the next task and the next task. And it all kind of plays hand in hand, right? So it goes as early as like how you collect data is going to impact how you decide to share it with the review team. How the review team conducts their selection processes will impact how you do your reporting. And so we want to create kind of this topic around like why systems are important, like what are the kind of common core consistencies that go into a grant. And then on the other end of the funnel, like what does a very common, well-established grant management workflow look like? That obviously you can layer on top kind of custom unique workflows and your own unique needs and processes that you have internally. So that's kind of the goal here today. I'll kind of get into those systems here in just a minute. In about 30 seconds or less, my name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewer. I've been doing this now for over 10 years. So we have a pretty deep background as part of the review committee for things like grants and scholarships and funding opportunities. That's why we named the company a Reviewer, because that was the life that we lived. So we went way back in the day when it was all done through paper. So literally hundreds and hundreds of physically mailed in binders and grant applications to our doorstep. We were tasked with handwriting notes and feedback and scores and either physically mailing it back in or to meet on the weekends with other board members and other committee members. And we just hash out the details until we narrow down who we wanted to fund. And as you can imagine, as a volunteer, it was very comprehensive, right? I'm a father now of two. I don't have the time to do that nowadays. To see this kind of induction of online tools. And so a lot of organizations started to spin up built-in web forms and emails and a lot of downloading of documents and lots and lots and lots of spreadsheets. And as a volunteer specifically on the review committee side of things, there were some definite benefits to that, right? Like there were components that were online that absolutely were streamlined, but none of them were end-to-end systems. So what we found was happening is we often were downloading documents. We were having to go to Google Drive to find like these grant applications. We were collaborating on like Google Docs and shared folders. And there was a lot of room for potential human error. And then two really awful things started happening over and over and over again. Number one was lost information. So to the extreme examples of, people might apply through fillable PDFs. They would send you an email with a bunch of attachments. Those might go to spam, or as you download and as you export them, it never got to us. And so there were use cases where obviously compliance is being tested because we were awarding funding and finding out later on, months later, that there were deserving qualified candidates that never even got included in the review. So number one, again, compliance is a problem. But number two is that we were volunteers. We are mission-driven based individuals at our company. That's how we started. And it just breaks our heart that we were seeing that happening. Like there were deserving candidates that literally didn't have the opportunity. On top of that, in a relatively close-knit community, we saw firsthand potential biases being put forward by other committee members, right? There was no redaction of data, things like demographic details weren't being hidden. And when we went to sit down to do reviews, there was data being shared with us that negatively impacted potentially our selection process. And we were not selecting the most qualified candidates because of all these external factors. So we basically then at that point said, look, we got to do something about this. We built Reviewers and online software to do really two things. One is create an extreme amount of efficiency. You guys as foundations and as nonprofits and as grant makers are asked to wear a lot of different hats. And so how do we help you focus on what hats matter the most at that given time? But at the same time, I think the key point here is how do we elevate the experience? And I use that term quite a bit, experience, because it's not just from your perspective, but also your applicants, your board members, your volunteers, your all these other stakeholders that make up the bulk of these programs. So we do thousands and thousands of these campaigns every single year. What we build here at Review, we're not going to get too deep into the weeds of the system. Is really a built by the people for the people type of infrastructure. Nobody knows more about your processes and how to run a grant than you guys. So who are we to say, hey, here's features and software that you should use? Why don't you tell us exactly what you need and then we'll build it for you? And so now again, it's become a brainchild over the last 10 years of a platform that really does have a lot of the components from end-to-end management. And I like to call them systems, again, kind of coming back to today's conversation. So kind of breaking this down a bit more, like why do systems matter? And there's a quote by John Doerr that basically says, ideas are easy, execution is everything. I think it's an incredible quote that we can apply to our personal lives as well as our operations. It's easy for us to come up with these grand ideas of how we want to implement a grant making program, how we want to operate, how we want to do things. But once you kind of get boots on the ground and begin to actually execute it, that is what matters most, right? If anything gets missed, the negative impacts it has and the ramifications as we go. So the idea is that how do we kind of remove any barriers or thought about it? So all we can do is execute, right? We have all the processes, tools, and systems in place where there is no thought, right? We know exactly at this time, this is exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to do it correctly. And then when we move on to the next task, we know that we're in a position for success. And again, the idea behind this is like a flywheel where all of our actions impact future actions as well as other people. So, properly executing a very low barrier grant application creates better opportunity and visibility to those in need. That in return generates better content that they're going to be submitting back to you guys. You're going to go through a really well thought out review and selection process. We can ensure that you are funding and awarding the most best applicants to serve your mission and your vision. And then that kind of rolls back up to your own internal grant reporting of how do we measure impact, right? So it really is like a full on, everything is intertwined, kind of the circle of life type of concept here. So this is at a very high level, a snapshot of the conversation I had the other day. I talked a little bit about how I was talking with this organization and they mentioned like there's three core components to go into a grant. There's collection of data, you have to be able to manage it, and then you have to review it, right? But then next within each one of those, they talked about a wide variety of tools and processes. I didn't talk process here, a wide variety of tools that they were using to execute those tasks. And they explained to me, well, I was using Google Forms to collect the applications, but people couldn't save and log out. So I was actually missing out on people. And then once these Google Forms came in, I had to do something with it. So I found myself downloading and exporting into spreadsheets. I would re-upload them back into, say, for example, Google Sheets or Google Drive. I had no way to communicate with people. So what I instead had to do then is use Constant Contact, my own personal inbox. And then by the time I got to do a review, it was an absolute nightmare. I was downloading and exporting into other folders. I was shipping out these master spreadsheets. They were adding their notes. One of the judges would accidentally misclick and break my formula. So I had to rewrite this. Conversation goes on and on and on. And so I basically, we in real time took that and we said, I wonder what that actually looks like. So we tossed it into Chat GPT and we said, if I was to run a grant with these workflows and these processes, what would it look like? And this is what it kicked out. So it's kind of funny. We laugh a little bit, right? And all the misspellings, and it's obviously very siloed. And we're asked to kind of go administer these grant funds. And just be honest with us, nobody else knows besides us, like all the moving parts and stresses and elements and components that go into that. Your friends, your family, your other staff members, your coworkers don't know about the long hours Wednesday at 9 o'clock at night when you're trying to recompile documents and send follow-up emails for people's grading templates, right? All they know is at the very end of the day, the success of the program because of the hard work that you put in. How do we take this? Obviously, we can also visualize the impact that has. So not just on you guys, but also your applicants and your volunteers. I'm not going to go through this entire list, right? But obviously, the inconsistent data collection processes, maybe duplicates or lost data, increased human error, obviously a significant amount of human capital and time. I think we can all agree, as good as we may be our spreadsheets, spending 3/4 of our time downloading and exporting and recompiling probably isn't the best use of our staff time. And then the negative impact that has down the road, right? Frustration and low engagement, delays in the selection process and the awarding of funds, the lack of transparency. I mean, this list really can go on and on and on. Kind of a plot twist, I'll share this stuff out afterwards. That way you guys can kind of spend some more time looking through it. So if this is any of you guys, I'm not here to offend anybody. Again, we've built this company because we lived this life. So I know for a fact that this is the type of stuff that's happening. And so my goal here is to say, look, how do we take all of those kind of moving pieces and all of those tools and processes and workflows and systems, and on the other end, spit out kind of a very clear, concise, collective workflow where we really are going back to blocking and tackling of collecting, managing, reviewing, and of course, at some point, reporting and going through that process as well. So my goal here today is two things. One is kind of to introduce what does a very common, well-structured grant workflow look like that has all these systems in place. Again, there's more than what we're going to talk about here. And also visually, what does that look like? So obviously, being a reviewer, I'm going to show you how our system handles it. But just keeping in mind that there's other platforms, there's other tools out there. You guys are going to do whatever you want to do. Just keeping in mind that it's critical to have an infrastructure in place that does have all of those systems. And not to get too deep into more terrible horror stories, I promise I am a very jolly person. But the problem that we hear sometimes is you go through the entire process, checks are cut, and somebody doesn't receive funding, right? And they throw a fit about it, they're complaining, they call you up and they say, hey, you didn't fund me because of XYZ reason. And that's what I call a proof of process. So without having these systems in place, it's very hard from us from a compliance perspective to be able to go back and say, look, when you apply to our program, this is exactly what we said we were going to do. You were going to submit this information, you're going to be reviewed this many times, you're going to be evaluated on this type of score sheet, and then in fact here's proof that we followed that process. That's kind of what I'm trying to get us to at this point in time. So what is that first kind of system? And there's multiple systems obviously nested within these. And it's the submission experience. And I'll visualize this for you and show you in real time. I think one of our more well-ran grant programs. But the number one goal when you create this system is you have to do two things. One, collect the data that you need, because at some point you're going to have to review it and then make decisions off of it, right? But number two is how do you put the applicants in a position for success? So you have to lower the barrier for them. We want them to be able to get into the grant submission process. We want them to have no thought whatsoever on processes or workflows, trying to figure out how to fill a fillable PDF. Is the system going to work or not? Do I have to work offline, then come back later? I want them to focus exactly on submitting the best version of their grant application or their grant writing that puts them in a position for success. And so as you can kind of see, there are some kind of core components or systems that go into a well-structured grant application. Obviously, there's going to be quantitative measurements, right? So how much money do you need is the most kind of common core question. If we were to fund you, like, what is this money going to go towards? How are you going to budget it? How are you going to measure success? How long-term sustainable is it? And then at some point, we're going to have you come back and do some grant reporting. And then obviously in between there's other variables like, are you collecting things like references, which is an emerging trend that we've started to see. I think this is a very timely conversation, especially as I talk through like long-term sustainability and how success is going to be measured. Over the last 48 hours, I think for most of you as a foundation or as a nonprofit, your world's kind of potentially got flipped upside down, right? There was the administration's kind of initial pause on funding and freezing of grants and loans, and that affected a lot of nonprofits and foundations. But if we kind of scale back and look at like, why did that happen? And the question kind of came up was there's a significant amount of funding and money being distributed out. And we're trying to figure out is how do we actually show impact that when those funds were distributed, it served a purpose. And that's kind of where I think we can really press grant reporting and the long-term sustainability of your grantees to be able to kind of go back and measure and showcase, look, here's the checks that were cut, here's how we change people and or organizations' lives, and long-term, here's how we're going to continue to thrive and be sustainable. I think that has to be incorporated into every single one of your grant applications. If I walk away here today with no other tidbits or knowledge, that's the one core thing that we have to be able to report back to our stakeholders that, look, we set out on this grand mission and vision where we exist for a reason, and here's actual proof that we've been able to impact people's lives at its absolute core. So what does that submission experience look like? And again, some of you are using tools, that's great. Others may still be using, built-in global PDFs on the website that you're asking people to work offline on, and they're sending it to through email. So a pretty common application structure would be to start with your website, right? You want people to be able to publicly go and learn more about your campaign. And then it all starts with a concept called a profile. So the idea behind a profile is basically there are so many moving parts to an application or to a grant. You've got people, and then you have submissions, right? Submissions is plural because you have the initial grant application, and then long term you might have additional deliverables that you need from them. To the extent of some of our grants that we work with here at Review are like 5-6 year long grant program, and every month or every quarter for 4, 5, 6 years, the grantees have to come back and submit like grant reporting templates. So on top of that, you've got communication, review and selection processes, a bunch of file uploads, either receipts or ongoing data collection, tax documentation. And so how do you take all these moving parts and all these elements and centralize them into one hub? So we do that through a concept called a profile. So applicants come in, they basically create their account, and from there, forever and ever and ever, any activities that's associated with them get logged in that one centralized place. I am not showing you a grant application. I did this on purpose. Because one of the things I wanted to show you here as we're talking about systems is eligibility. So for many of you, you might have very, very hyper-specific criteria for your programs. And you want to do maybe a combination of two things. Number one is you want to ensure that people who are not eligible physically cannot apply. It's a waste of their time. It's also a waste of yours. And it's a bad look on the organization. Number two is some of you have very hyper-specific grants where those eligibility criteria maybe aren't black and white, or they're so unique and so specific that there's a demographic or an audience of people that are very qualified to apply, but they don't even know that it exists. We've heard of some programs that have funds that go unfunded just because nobody applied to it. And the reason why is they had no idea they were eligible. So the first system I want to talk about is kind of a matching process where in theory, applicants can come in, they can tell us a bit more about who they are. We're building what I call an applicant persona about them. And then we can leverage that persona to create what I call a personalized experience. So the system will ask a series of questions, very customized and unique to your processes and your data. And as soon as they advance on, it'll say, hey, based on what you just submitted to us, these are the 3 opportunities or the 2 opportunities that we have available. Which of or all of them do you want to apply for? Again, those are pre-vetted, so we're recommending because we know that they're eligible. And then B, since we know that they're eligible, you can ensure that you don't have ineligible people going on. Now, from there, the idea is that the system will then start to serve up a personalized experience. If I chose like the Equitable Excellence Grant or whatever your programs are, from there on out, you're going to be able to collect very hyper-specific grant applications from them. So even though they all kind of enter through one centralized kind of process, leveraging personalized experiences, we're now going to be able to create custom forms for each one of them. So as they kind of progress on, then we get into the bulk of the data collection. So for many of you, this is what a very common grant may look like. It starts off number one with us. So there's your grant matching. Learning more about them, either as an individual or if it's like a nonprofit or an organization-wide grant. Who are you? Gets into the bulk here of the application. So the thought here is that, again, I want you guys to focus, or the applicants to focus on their content creation, not getting bogged down in processes. So they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. They just interact with the prompts and the questions as they appear. So how does this align with our mission and vision? If you have a budget, please upload it here. We're going to come back to those file uploads. It's a critical component here because we live in a digital age where there are so many different types of files. Like if you were to record a video on your iPhone, it's going to have like 6 potential different file formats. It's going to be a gigantic file. So now we have to worry about, can you and or your review team actually access that file? Do you have like the accessibility tools in place to do it? What happens if you've got a evaluator who is a board member who's traveling and they're using their iPads, right? How do you ensure they don't get stuck? So things like that, that's where the systems come into play. And then this application gets deeper into like the need, how are you going to utilize the grants? And then again, I want to make sure I bookend this. So in the grant application, we want to say, how are we going to define success? How sustainable is this? And then what metrics are we going to be utilizing to measure your outcomes? Because at some point in time, if this person is, I want to be able to go back to those prompts and say, you told us that this is how you're going to define success and measure outcomes. Now report back on those elements, those KPIs that you told us that you were going to be measuring against. And then we'll start to ask questions like, what was the metric? What was the target? What did you hit? What was the discrepancy between the actual outcome versus the anticipated outcome? And then, of course, as we dive deeper into like additional funding needs, or if you have to expand budgets, like that's where the sustainability side of things come back in. So you really are building your post-grant impact surveys off of the data being collected on the front end in their forms. And it should all kind of flow together. From here, we kind of get deeper into the weeds as far as the components go. Again, there's file uploads that are being submitted, you name it. I'm going to pause there. So some of you are doing references. It's becoming an emerging trend with grant making, but I don't want to spend too much time here talking about it today. It's basically in a very how do I say this nicely? In a very competitive space, how do you have an applicant or a grantee differentiate themselves versus others? And a lot of times that is through things like letters of support or letters of recommendation. The problem is I hate letters of recommendation. I think that they're very canned, standardized. It's a better reflection of the person writing it than who it's actually about. So we've got these pretty cool triggers where it actually would notify the reference saying, hey, Kyle's asked you to write a reference on his behalf, click here to do it. And then instead of submitting a letter, which you can still do, it instead asks them to fill out what I call a reference template. So they answer a series of questions that are served up to them. That way you can ensure consistency that every candidate has the same data associated with them. It also lowers the barrier for that person, in return getting higher quality results back. So with that said, I want to jump on here. I'm trying to make sure I'm being sensitive to your guys' time here today for question and answers. Is the next system, which is probably what most of you are here for, which is operationally speaking. So again, I go back to the beginning of the conversation with the second kind of pillar, which was managing information. We started to break out like, what does that really mean? And it's not just storing your grant applications. What that really means is having, number one, first and foremost, at the top of the list, a very safe, secure, compliant data security in place. These are PII, these are financial information, these are nonprofits. We have to ensure that we have all the safety mechanisms in place that we can actually store this information. In no way, shape, or form can we possibly be collecting financial information, audits, tax documentation, any of this type of stuff via email or holding on to it in spreadsheets that get shared that way, right? It has to be done in a very dedicated platform with all the safety mechanisms in place to protect both you, but also your grantees and your applicants. On top of that, like what are the core components that we need then to actually manage the operations? And again, going back to systems, they can't be disconnected, right? So for example, communication. Can you send communication through your own personal emails? Yes, you bet. Or would you rather have it in the built-in platform where the applications live, where there's an audit trail and records that the applicants can kind of come back, they can respond back, and we can kind of see how we got to this point. On top of that, monitoring progress. A lot of these programs are extremely date and deadline sensitive. Applications open, applications close. We have to cut checks by a certain time. So how do we bring visibility into where we're at, as well as send reminder messages from people like, hey, you know what, you were selected. Now it's time for your grant report template, stuff like that. At some point in time, you're going to need to take all of your grant applications and then share them with the team for review and selection, right? It's not as simple as saying, hey, so-and-so, go review all 200, 500, 30 applications. For many of you, we'll get more to this in a minute, you might have dedicated protocols in place of, I don't want anybody to review more than 10 submissions. I want every applicant to get reviewed by a certain committee. So how do you start to bifurcate out and take your grant applications and distribute them to the proper people? And then from there, how do you provide them the tools to do built-in review, scoring, selection, ranking, deliberation? If it's a multi-phase program, again, if you have ongoing data reporting needs, all of those are the elements that we have to consider from an operation perspective. So to help visualize that, and we'll move pretty quick through this, it's basically your command center. So all of our clients here review get some type of command center. It's relatively adaptable depending on your processes and workflows. But at a high level, it's going to say, look, here's what's going on. Here's how many submissions we've received. Here's who's done. Here's who's not done. Here's who's in kind of the grant reporting phase. Here's who's not done there. Here's who's are done. You can send them reminder messages. You can extend deadlines, all the things that you'd expect to be able to have to do on a daily basis. This is like your command center where you kind of live and die by. From there, we can start to really dive deeper into the applications. So I mentioned beforehand the concept of a profile. Going very old, so whatever that process was, there's a lot of manipulation and recompiling. So ideally, in whatever tools you use, you'll basically get a list of every grant application, and then when you click into it, it will instantly and automatically in real time build you a grant profile. So going circa 2012, it's that concept of a binder, but now it's virtualized. So I have, in this case, Michael. Michael is a grant applicant. In the center of my page is all the content we collected from Michael. So this is the submission form, the file uploads, absolutely everything. On top of that, I can send direct communication to Michael, right? So I can store it here. He or she can kind of come back. They can respond back to me. I may want to log internal communication or notes as well. So maybe you have a team of people who are all collaborating, and as they're reviewing Michael's information, they want to log notes to one another and kind of collaborate or deliberate. They do so. File uploads, I talked about that earlier on. So every single file or deliverable that was ever added either for Michael, on behalf of Michael, or from Michael, list. From there, you can absolutely still download and export, but the idea is that your team can simply click into it, they can open it up, and then boom, there is the file uploads directly in the system. So you can interact with it, you can kind of side by side, leave your comments, leave your notes, fill out score sheets, and not to leave the system. And again, it also creates consistency. I don't care if this was a PDF, a .text file, a .word document. I don't really care if it was a scanned visual image. They all show up here the same. On top of that, we can kind of move on to our supplemental forms. So the idea here is that any ongoing data collection from your grantee. So let's play a game. Let's again say hypothetically, let's go back to Michael. He or she was selected, and what we want to do is have Michael come back into the system, click Add New, and this is where they would submit their like post grant deliverable surveys, their acceptance packets, their impact, or whatever you want to call them. So he or she would just pick from a list like what that deliverable is that you're requesting from them. They go ahead and open it up, and then boom, there it is. So he or she would then just simply, in this case, fill it out. Now, as you can see here, this grant reporting template does align with the application form. So I have, how much was requested. Here's your stated goals. Here's the actual outcome. And here's my explanation of like the discrepancy between my stated goal versus the actual. These are the metrics that you told me that you were going to be measuring yourself on, target versus actual. What type of both qualitative and quantitative impact have you had? Here's a breakdown of the funds. It's like an up-to-date budget of, we cut you $1 million check. Here's what happened with it. Any future funding needs that you might have, how do you plan for sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the beauty of that is once this grant reporting template is profile. So kind of going back to this page, you're going to see then a list of every one of those deliverables. And then when I click into it, you'll know content that was submitted. So from a reporting perspective, what makes reporting without systems in place very, very challenging is that generally it's disconnected. In this example, I've got Michael, the grantee, and I have with tabs who they are, every single form that was ever filled out, either in the actual application or ongoing data, every single file. I have activity logs, I have communication, I've got judging and scoring results, all logged in one place. So when you go to generate reports, it's very, very easy because it's all together nicely, neatly organized, almost as if it was already intended to be reported on, right? So the last thing I want to kind of touch on here again, so I can save ample time for questions, is probably the most important conversation today, and systems and tools in place for conducting reviews. Because at the end of the day, you can have the most efficient application process possible. It's low barrier, it's super simple. You guys are a well-oiled machine. You're very efficiently speaking, operationally doing things. But then it comes down to the review side. We need our review team to be able to come in, again, that's why we named the company reviewer, access the content very quickly, very, very easily, and take action on it. Every single applicant deserves to have the proper energy allocated to it to ensure that they get a fair opportunity. And so not to get too deep into this, but we've done some studies as far as like on average, how many applications can a typical volunteer read? And that number is like 15 to 20, which is a very, very small number. So if you have, 30, 40, 50 submissions and you ask your review team to score all of them, how can we confidently tell us that, they gave the same energy to number 31 that they gave to number one? And I don't know if we can. And so if that is the case, then we have to create systems to make them so efficient that they can potentially score or look at 30, 40, or 50 submissions. Part of that battle is then also deciding which grant applications get reviewed by which people. It's a very custom, personalized kind of discussion that you're going to have to have. Do you have committees by grant, multi-phase program, where you've got like an internal, development team who's in charge of doing a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, and then another team that does a score, and then you narrow it down to the top 20, and then a board member comes in and reviews them. That list can go on and on. What's critical there, though, is that you have a process in place where you can very quickly take your large number of applications. And when I say large, what I really mean is all of your applications, and then divvy it out to your team in some type of fair, non-biased, compliant, scalable model. And then once you give them those grant applications, the next piece to this puzzle is how do you ensure that they're consistently reviewed? Far too often, there's not clear expectations from our review teams or our board members of how we want them to review applications. I think we've gotten to a point now where the majority of organizations have some type of like guiding principles or score sheet that they follow. But there was a time when you'd share your grant applications, a team would look at them and very subjectively say, yep, this is the one that I want to fund. Nope, not this one. And we have no way of knowing how they came up with those ideas. And we're concerned around like, did some evaluators, review somebody on a totally separate kind of ideology or thought process that doesn't align with what we're looking for as a grant making organization. So the idea here is if you can redact any data, ideally do so. If there's anything that you're collecting that may negatively impact how the review team looks at that submission, let's remove it, that bias. And then number two, let's give them some type of like mathematic rudimentary selection tool that at least gives us data to start with. I'm not saying that we have to live and die by score sheets, but that data does help power really well constructed deliberation meetings. In fact, best practice would be do a review and then maybe pre-share the results to your team before they do deliberations. That way we're not wasting people's time in a meeting. They can kind of come prepared to kind of hash out why they chose people the way that they did. So that's a pretty complex process, even though at its core it sounds simple. So what does that look like? At least within our system, it's called buckets. And again, this can be configured a million different ways. That's a overarching example. But if you have multiple different grant programs, you might have a bucket per grant. Maybe you then take it and you add a second layer. So phase one, phase two, phase three. Maybe you want to go committee number one, committee number two, whatever you want to do. But the end goal there is to basically say, hey, look, here's a bucket in this case called the Linux Wild Grant. And I need to do two things. Number one is I have to fill it up with a bunch of grantees. And then number two is I have to fill it up with a team of potential reviewers. So in our example here, whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark log into Reviewer, they're physically only able to see the entries in the Linux Wilder grant. On the flip side, whenever Sally, Sue, and Steve come in, they're only able to see the applications to the Bobby Gatsby grant. Again, we're basically creating privileges and user levels of who can see what and when. Now, bigger picture, you absolutely can open these buckets up and get really granular. So it'll actually show you a list in real time of all of the grant applications, who the potential evaluators or reviewers or judges, call it whatever you want, are. And then you can start to pair them up. So you could say, okay, well, you know what? For the sake of compliance, I just want to make sure that none of my board members are looking at more than 10 people, but no less than 15 or 5. You could also say, for the sake of compliance, I want to make sure that every single grantee is looked at exactly 3 times, no more, no less. And then the system would then take all of your applications, it would look at who the reviewers are, and then it would equally and randomly distribute them out for you with the press of one button. Now, from there, you by all means can start to override it. So you can do very manual pairings, basically saying, okay, well, in this case, I have Mark Judge. I don't want Mark to score Gabrielle, so I can uncheck her name, and I can reassign it to Gilligan. So there's lots of flexibility. But again, we're basically taking a large pool of applications and then somehow getting it to our review team, either in bulk, using automation, manually, whatever you can dream up. last piece of that puzzle is, okay, great. So then what happens next? So Mark comes into the system, and then this is the entire quote unquote review system that we want to talk about, where they have a very simple list of the grantees. If you are redacting data, that's great. You can hide their information from here, and then you simply click on their names, open them up, and it shows them a split screen. So again, I keep using the term system. There's obviously systems nested within systems, but you have your selection tool on the other. So the idea is that every single evaluator or judge or committee member has very clear guiding principles of how you want them to review. They answer a series of questions. One of the emerging trends that we've started to define lately is stop asking judges or reviewers to allocate points. So 1 through 10, 1 through 15. They get super bogged down in those numbers, and instead try to align the questions with your application and your organization's mission and vision, and then ask them emotional responses. So from like good to bad, or from good, great, ugly. It's a bad example. How do you feel about this? And generally speaking, as you elicit an emotional response, you get their first judgment, which is usually the best answer. So they just answer a series of questions. And then behind the scenes, you still assign point value. So good might be 1 point, great might be 2 points, whatever it might be. So the review team very easily and seamlessly can toggle back and forth. They can read the application, they can look at the file uploads, they can leave their notes, they can look at budgets, and then ultimately when they're done, they just press submit, boom, they're on to the next. But then you guys in real time get full visibility. So you get this kind of built-in leaderboard that shows you in real time every grant application, who reviewed it, if they're done, if they're not done, individual scores, total scores, average scores. And for some of you that are very cut and dry metric people, which I think is a trend that we're starting to see quite a bit of, just to kind of cover ourselves from a compliance perspective, these are the results, right? Leslie is a grant awardee because she had the highest score. Others will say, you know what, this data is super helpful. Let's now take this page, turn it into a deliberation, and our team will talk about why we scored people we did. And maybe there's a really compelling case that now Richard is the highest rated applicant, or maybe everybody is selected. And what you're going to do now is start to allocate dollars. So Leslie gets X number of dollars, and then Gilligan gets X number of dollars. Maybe it's a multi-phase program. From there you can start to select their names from this list and advance them on to the next page. So pretty long-winded. I don't want to take up too much of your afternoon here today. I did talk a lot about systems, and just to kind of show that we've hopefully thought of virtually everything. Let me rephrase that. People like yourselves have done grants so many different unique ways, and you guys have thought of everything that you brought it to us, that we even have some pretty cool components in the system that helps you identify judging trends. So for example, like here's a list of judges, not to get too deep into the weeds, and they'll say on average, Judge Judy gives about 24 points, but then Tony gives about 34 points. So what if you were one of the organizations that does random assignments where every applicant was randomly assigned to a judging committee, and you unfortunately got the short straw, and you got Judge Judy? That basically tells me that you are going to be scored on average 10 points lower than your peers who got scored by Tony. That's a big problem. So now we know that, and you guys can start to take action on that either internally, or this report will actually shuffle the results and then normalizes it and tells you, look, you actually don't care what you were scored. All we really care about is, are you being scored higher than lower than averages, both from that individual judge and then amongst other applicants. And then the system will then reorganize the results and let you know how they were scored. So I'm not here today to kind of showcase this. I am trying to showcase that when I talk about systems, I really do mean that there has to be protocols and systems in place for the entire life cycle of your grant, from launching a website and having marketing going out all the way to like post grant impact reporting 4 years from now.